Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into a relationship that's really shaped societies for, well, millennia. It's this dynamic between spiritual authority and temporal power. Still feels relevant somehow, doesn't it?
It really does, and we'll be exploring this using René Guénon's work, specifically his spiritual authority and temporal power. The translation we're looking at is by Henry D. Fore, edited by Samuel D. Fore.
Right. And our mission for you today is to really try and get under the skin of Guénon's perspective on this interplay between spiritual guidance and, well, worldly rule. We want to pull out his key ideas, about authority, hierarchy, knowledge, and how they all fit together, or sometimes how they clash.
Yeah, and what's striking right from Guénon's first chapter is that he makes it clear this isn't some new problem. This tension, this opposition between the spiritual and the temporal, it's ancient. It pops up everywhere, across different times, different traditions.
Okay, so he starts with this idea of a fundamental opposition. These two forces often seem at odds throughout history. But does he explain why? What's the root of that tension?
Well, yes, he highlights the opposition, but then he goes deeper. He suggests they actually come from a common principle. It's like they're linked indivisibly at some higher level before they even seem distinct. Like two sides of the same coin, almost.
Ah, okay, so not just enemies locked in a struggle, but connected at a fundamental level. What does Guénon say about this origin point?
He points towards what he calls a primordial spirituality. He mentions the Hindu term Hamsa, which represents, that ultimate undifferentiated source. That's the wellspring, he argues, where both spiritual authority and temporal power originate.
Interesting. And this primordial source, it leads to a specific kind of social organization he discusses, the traditional four castes.
He does discuss that, yeah. And he's quite insistent that this hierarchical setup, with its specific duties and knowledge for each caste, isn't just social layering like we might think of it today. For him, it reflects a deeper symbolic order. Different functions, all necessary.
It sounds like he feels we've kind of lost the plot in our modern focus on equality, maybe missing the point of hierarchy as he sees it.
That's exactly it. He contrasts our modern ideal, which often leans towards a kind of flattening equality, with a traditional view. That view emphasizes functional differences, people doing different complementary jobs. It's not about better or worse in a social sense, but about fulfilling essential roles. Think of organs in a body, all different, all vital.
That's a useful way to think about it. Different roles, same goal, a functioning whole. He even mentions a specific symbol related to this balance, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. In a footnote, the symbol of the bear and the bee seen together sometimes. It's interpreted as representing this very harmony, temporal strength, the bear, and spiritual wisdom, the bee, a powerful image of cooperation.
Right, which really underlines his warning about how we interpret these old symbols.
Absolutely. He stresses that we can't just slap our modern ideas onto them. We need to try and understand them within their own symbolic language to get their real meaning, the concepts they were designed to convey.
So the exercise here isn't about making direct, easy comparisons to now, but really trying to grasp the original spirit behind these ideas.
Exactly that. The goal is to understand the mindset, the worldview, from which these concepts of authority and hierarchy emerged in traditional societies, to see it through their eyes, so to speak.
Okay, let's shift focus then to the functions themselves, priesthood and royalty. Guénon sees them as distinct, clearly, but also fundamentally linked.
Yes, Chapter 2 really gets into this. He details the separate functions. Priesthood is about spiritual authority, knowledge, wisdom. Royalty is about temporal power, action, force. But crucially, they need each other. They're interdependent.
And he's pretty clear on which should lead, isn't he?
Oh, very clear. Guénon argues that spiritual authority must precede and guide temporal power. The idea is that action in the world should be informed by, well, higher truths, by genuine understanding.
Which brings us to that idea of sacerdotal consecration for royalty. What's the real weight behind that?
That act, the consecration by the priesthood, is what truly legitimizes the king's power in this traditional view. It infuses it with a sacred quality. It's like a stamp of approval from the spiritual realm, signifying the rule isn't just based on might, but is aligned with divine principles.
He brings up the Kshatriya caste as an example. Their role is force, governance, but it's still tied to something higher.
Exactly. The Kshus, the warrior ruler caste, wields power, yes, but their legitimacy, their proper function, comes from being aligned with spiritual principles. Ideally, guided by the Brahmins, the priestly caste. Their strength serves a higher order.
So in these traditional frameworks, you absolutely need both spiritual guidance and temporal execution for balance.
Precisely. Both are seen as essential pillars, necessary not just for social harmony, but even for maintaining a kind of cosmic balance. You need both wisdom and action properly aligned.
And this whole concept, Guénon keeps saying, is something the modern West really struggles with.
Yeah, that's a constant refrain. He feels that modern Western thought has largely lost this understanding of the distinct roles and, more importantly, the necessary organic link between the spiritual and the temporal.
Which leads us neatly into Chapter 3, focusing on knowledge and action. There's definitely a hierarchy there in his view.
Absolutely. Guenon really emphasizes that effective action, especially governing, must flow from true knowledge, from wisdom, spiritual understanding. Spiritual authority is the source of that guidance.
So knowledge isn't just theory. It has direct, practical implications for how power is used or misused.
Definitely. Guenon warns about the dangers when temporal power acts without that spiritual foundation.
Yeah.
It can lead to disorder, injustice, basically power detached from its proper purpose.
He talks about supreme knowledge, too. How does that fit in?
Supreme knowledge for Guenon is tied directly to the spiritual order. It's the understanding of ultimate truths, first principles. And this highest knowledge should ideally illuminate all action, especially governance. It's like the ultimate map and compass.
It really does contrast sharply with our modern tendency to prioritize action, results, material things, sometimes pushing deeper wisdom aside.
That's a central critique he makes. He sees the traditional view, where knowledge holds primacy, as being turned upside down in modernity. We often value action, often disconnected from principle, above all else.
Let's dig a bit deeper into those roles with Chapter 4, focusing on the Brahmins and Kshatriyas as sort of embodying these two poles.
Right. He looks at them as archetypes. The Brahmin representing spiritual authority through wisdom, the Kshatriya representing temporal power through strength. He even uses the Sphinx as an analogy combining intellect and might.
The Sphinx, yeah. Wisdom and strength together. That's a powerful image for their relationship.
It is. And he stresses their complementary nature. Society works best, he argues, when they cooperate harmoniously, wisdom guiding strength. One really needs the other.
But even though they're distinct, they still trace back to that same ultimate source you mentioned earlier.
Correct. He keeps bringing it back to that. Despite their specialized roles, their origin is in that same primordial unity. That's the foundation of the whole traditional structure as he sees it.
So what happens if they deviate? If that harmony breaks down?
Well, according to Guénon, that's when things go wrong. If either caste strays from its essential nature, or if their relationship becomes antagonistic, it leads to societal imbalance, disorder. It throws the whole system off kilter.
Chapter 5 really hammers home this idea of royalty's dependence on the priesthood. It feels like a cornerstone of his argument.
It absolutely is.
Right.
He argues very strongly that temporal power needs spiritual authority for its legitimacy and its proper function. This dependence isn't a weakness, in his view, but the very thing that grounds royalty and gives its power meaning.
And if that connection is severed, what's the risk then?
The risk, Guénon says, is that temporal power becomes arbitrary, just based on force or whim. It gets detached from justice, from higher principles. It loses its moral compass, essentially, and can become tyrannical.
He points to historical examples where priests guided rulers, right?
Yes, he alludes to numerous traditions where the priesthood played a vital role in consecrating rulers, advising them, ensuring their actions aligned with spiritual laws. It was a way to keep power accountable to something beyond itself.
So the danger arises when royalty tries to go it alone, to claim absolute independence.
That's the implication. When temporal power attempts to assert total autonomy from the spiritual, it breaks that essential link, potentially leading to abuses of power, social breakdown, and a loss of that connection to the sacred order.
Which kind of sets the scene for Chapter 6, the revolt of the Kshatriyas. Sounds traumatic.
It's presented as a critical turning point. Guénon talks about this historical shift, this revolt, where the temporal power, the Kshatriyas, tries to dominate or even take over the role of the spiritual authority, the Brahmins.
What would drive that, and what are the consequences Guénon describes?
The drivers could be ambition, a rejection of spiritual constraints, maybe a fundamental misunderstanding of the necessary balance. The consequences for Guénon are severe. Social chaos, a loss of true spiritual understanding within the ruling class, and a weakening of the entire traditional foundation.
So it's more than just politics. It's seen as a break from the proper, even divine order.
Exactly. It represents a fundamental disruption of what Guénon considers the natural or divinely intended hierarchy where spiritual wisdom guides temporal action. It's turning away from the source, in a way.
Then Chapter 7 goes into the specifics.
Yeah.
The usurpations of royalty. How exactly does temporal power overstep?
Guénon outlines several ways. Rulers might claim divine status without legitimate spiritual sanction. They might meddle in religious matters, dictate doctrine, or try to control or suppress the priesthood itself, essentially taking on roles that aren't theirs.
And the long-term effects of these usurpations?
The long view, according to Guénon, is bleak. It leads to a decline of spiritual influence, a drift towards materialism, secularism, where higher principles are just forgotten. And ultimately, this breeds social instability because the foundations are eroded.
It sounds like it leads to a situation where nobody truly understands either realm properly anymore.
That's a good way to put it. When royalty usurps spiritual functions, it not only diminishes the spiritual sphere, but also distorts the real purpose and nature of temporal power itself. Both are degraded in the process.
Chapter 8 brings in these interesting ideas. The terrestrial paradise and the celestial paradise. How do they connect to this power balance?
Guénon uses these terms symbolically. The celestial paradise is the spiritual realm, the source of perfect order. The terrestrial paradise is the ideal state on Earth, which should reflect that celestial order. And achieving that reflection depends crucially on the right relationship between spiritual and temporal power.
So a well-ordered human society is meant to be a kind of mirror image of a higher reality.
That's the essence of it. The harmonious interplay between the spiritual guiding the temporal is what allows those higher principles to manifest on Earth, creating a society that reflects, however imperfectly, that divine blueprint.
And if that balance is lost, the reflection gets distorted.
Precisely. Imbalance or separation between these authorities leads society away from that ideal state. The mirror gets cracked, you could say. It results in disorder, disharmony, a falling away from that intended perfection.
And royalty has a specific symbolic job in maintaining this reflection.
Yes. When functioning correctly, guided by the spiritual, royalty acts as the key agent in maintaining this terrestrial order. It's the steward, the guardian of that reflection of the celestial within the earthly domain.
Which brings us to the final chapter, Chapter 9, the immutable law. This sounds like the real takeaway message.
It really is the culmination. Guénon concludes by talking about this immutable law governing the spiritual temporal relationship. It's not just a good idea or a historical pattern. He presents it as a fundamental, unchangeable principle, dictating that temporal power must be subordinate to spiritual authority for society to function correctly.
And trying to break that law, to reverse the order, what happens then?
Guénon is quite clear. Any attempt to fundamentally change this order, to put the temporal definitively above the spiritual, inevitably leads to negative outcomes. Loss of balance, decline, instability. There's a natural order, and violating it has consequences.
So for Guénon, genuine social harmony, real well-being, depends entirely on recognizing and respecting these distinct but interconnected roles.
Exactly. Recognizing that spiritual authority provides the wisdom, the why, and temporal power provides the action, the how, and respecting that inherent order that's presented as the absolute foundation for a stable, just, and truly thriving society.
Okay, so let's try to wrap our heads around the core of Guénon's argument here. We've got this ancient opposition, these distinct roles, spiritual wisdom, temporal action, yet they're deeply interdependent. He stresses the need for temporal power to be guided, legitimized by the spiritual, and he warns starkly about the dangers, the chaos that ensues when temporal power revolts or usurps that guidance. It all comes down to this immutable law, this necessary hierarchy. Essentially, a society forgetting spiritual principles and elevating power for its own sake is fundamentally out of balance.
That captures it very well. Guénon offers this deeply traditional perspective, doesn't he? Highlighting these principles of authority, knowledge, hierarchy that really challenge a lot of modern assumptions. It's a radically different way of looking at power.
It certainly gives you a different framework for thinking about power dynamics, historically and maybe even now. It prompts you to consider, without us making direct comparisons, of course, how these traditional ideas might offer a lens on the structures and tensions you see in the world today.
Absolutely. It invites you to reflect on these fundamental concepts: knowledge, authority, action, wisdom, power, as Guénon lays them out. How might his analysis, rooted in tradition, shed light on the complex interplay between these forces in any era, including our own? It leaves you thinking about that ongoing dance, doesn't it?